Well, with smartphones and smartwatches and all kinds of other devices, we can track all kinds of things about ourselves nowadays. How many steps did I take today? How far did I walk? How much did I sleep last night? How well is my blood pressure doing? How well is my heart rate doing? We can track all kinds of stuff about ourselves. So here's a question for you. How many times have you sighed lately? Maybe you've been sighing out of frustration because you're butting heads with someone at home or at work. Maybe you're sighing out of frustration at just everything going on in life in general right now. Maybe you're sighing because your heart is heavy. You're carrying grief and sadness with you, and you're saying, this is just too much. I'm tired of carrying this. I'm tired of this weight. Maybe we aren't counting how many times we sigh. Most likely, if you're like me, it's been too many to count. And it gets to the point where I can't count anymore and we just feel overwhelmed. Well, the prophet Isaiah has a lot to say about what it feels like to be filled with too much sighing, what it feels like to be overwhelmed by the circumstances of life. And his response is to give God's people hope, words of comfort, words of encouragement, words of hope about what God is going to do in their lives to take that away. And Isaiah chapter 35 is this wonderful chapter of hope and promise of God restoring his people, him redeeming them and rescuing them and bringing them home. And at the end of Isaiah chapter 35, the prophet Isaiah says, "And the ransomed of the Lord shall return." So the redeemed, the people that have been forgiven by God, shall return home, being back in a perfect relationship with him, and come to Zion with singing. Everlasting joy shall be upon their heads. And what I love is the reversal. So often we feel overwhelmed and burdened by all the sighing that's going on in our hearts and in our souls. And here's what the prophet Isaiah says. When God acts, when God works on behalf of his people, he turns it around. There's a reversal from sighing to singing. It says this, "And they shall be overwhelmed with gladness and joy." And what a beautiful promise. Instead of being overwhelmed with stress and worry and fear and anxiety and just always sighing, now we are overwhelmed with gladness and joy. And in the final part of the promise, "And sorrow and sighing shall flee away." That when God acts on our behalf to rescue us and redeem us through Jesus, we trade in sorrow and sighing and being overwhelmed by them. So instead we can be overwhelmed by gladness and joy. And I love the picture that sorrow and sighing are just going to flee. I have felt that in my own heart and heard so many people say that to me. I just want it to go away. I just want it to be done. We want that sigh and that sorrow, that heartache and that pain and that grief to go away. And here's how this promise is true for you. And the answer is Jesus and what he did on the cross for you. See, in other places in Scripture and in the book of Isaiah, Jesus is called a man of sorrows. And then when he's hanging on the cross to redeem you, to take away your sighing and your sorrow and to give you gladness and joy, at the end of his life, he sighs. He lets out a cry. And so Jesus becomes a man of sorrows so that you and I can be overwhelmed with gladness. And on the cross, Jesus sighs so that you can be filled with joy. And this is what God does in our lives. This is the hope that we have through our faith in Jesus. That he's going to overwhelm us with gladness and joy. And all the sorrow and all the sighing is going to flee away. God's peace to you.